Does that work? Or? Regular or? Okay, so that makes you 4 times regular. Yeah. Oh, I'm not regular at all. I was. This is only my 3rd one, and the last one was 27, like that. So I haven't been for a long time. They look different enough. Monitor looks good.
Thank you. Very rushed to get it.
Well, it doesn't look well. It's a lot of material there, or a lot of, interviews and data.
Yeah.
How long? Is it a year or 2? When did the hub start?
Started in October last year.
Okay, so
yeah. So it's the 48 law firms contributing.
I thought it was only 3, but then underneath them is.
Yeah, so the aggregate, short items. Possibility. Huge enterprise points, guys, 6.
Yeah.
Well, you can grow against the leverage model. Often work and you want to do more.
Really? So what do you want? Same law firms going deeper or more law firms?
Probably both. So we have an initial and we want to do more domains.
Yeah, that makes sense because it's quite sort of specific in procurement and what the other 2 are. There's so much more.
That's going to be kind of
yeah, which one will not be a problem?
Steve.
Yeah, they have all problem of the readiness stuff. Carbon pricing is probably too low, sort of then comes subsidies and fossil fuel subsidies. The relative price fossil fuel subsidies and carbon pricing still, just the carbon pricing. But it would be strange not to do carbon taxes and just do markets. Or somebody badly because they have tax, so you don't have the market.
We try to integrate
Yeah. But actually, you are very specific. It's strengths, you're right.
But like the OECD has a thing that's very broader, but very high level. I think the basic is basically what is the market price of the gas. Hard.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's the trade-off.
On budget or something. Glad I watched that because I've noticed there's some.
I briefly mentioned it, but it's going to get launched tomorrow, so I'll just like foreshadowing it.
Ready? Thanks for all my that's correct. Friday one. Friday one. That's the sort of thing work.
Hello, 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 hello. Hello. Oh, you can hear me through the... Okay, so I just have to speak quite loudly so that everyone in the room can hear me, I guess. Oh, okay, I see.
Everybody who would like to follow the discussions, you have to put on the headset.
I'll try and speak loudly.
loudly. Right. And I'm gonna
Online?
There's no online signals. Okay. Okay. So, okay, I'm gonna make a start. I'm hoping you can hear me. Okay, we're giving out some more headphones. Okay, so hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today, and apologies for a bit of a late start. My name's Daisy Dunn. I'm an associate editor at Carbon Brief, which is an online climate publication headquartered in the UK. I'm joined here by a wide panel of policy experts and researchers, and we're going to speak today a bit about what it means to have integrity in net zero, especially in the context of emerging economies and Ukraine. So first of all, I'm just going to hand over to Professor Sam Fankhauser. Can you tell us a bit about what integrity in net zero means from an academic perspective?
Thanks, Daisy, and good morning, everybody. This is my first panel with a headset on, so I'm getting used to the idea. Let me also, first of all, thank the Ukrainian pavilion for hosting us this morning. We're all Ukrainians this morning, which is lovely. Yeah, integrity of net zero is something that's very close to the program I'm involved in at the University of Oxford, which is called Oxford Net Zero. And it's quite a sort of a selfish obsession we have. Net zero as a concept was developed about 10 years ago, a bit more than 10 years ago, and a lot of Oxford academics, not me, but a lot of my colleagues were involved in defining the sort of net zero as a scientific concept. And it is a net zero. The logic of net zero is atmospheric physics, but the implementation of net zero is economic and societal and policy. And that integrity, therefore, matters. When we defined good net zero in Oxford, we sort of came up with 3 headings, if you will. One is the urgency of zero. So that's the urgent need to reduce emissions. The second is the integrity of net, recognizing that there will be some carbon removal, but that carbon removal has to be sort of done in a social, environmentally responsible way so that we have genuine global net zero. And then the third, so the urgency of zero, the integrity of net, and the sustainability of net zero, incorporating net zero as a climate concept, an emissions concept, into broader agendas of sustainable development, linking it to economic prosperity, for example, linking it to environmental protection, but also linking it to social outcomes. So the integrity of net zero, and I'll probably stop here, we can go deep later, is really quite broad. It isn't just, say, the greenwashing of carbon offsetting. It's the concept as a whole that we have to look at.
Thank you very much. Lord Alok Sharma, you were president of COP26. Oh, it's still working? Oh, it's just mine that aren't working. Okay. And you played a key role in shaping net zero commitments as president of COP26. As you see it now, what are the key challenges to ensuring net zero integrity?
I'm going to take this off because I don't like hearing myself speak. Well, firstly, thank you so much for inviting me. I think we did this last year as well in Dubai, which was great. Look, I mean, from an integrity point of view, let me sort of speak from a UK context. So I think there are effectively three things that you need to maintain the integrity of net zero. First is a legal framework which governments actually comply with. So in the UK, we have the Net Zero Act, Net Zero by 2050 enshrined in law. We have legally binding nearer term carbon budgets, and we have an independent climate change committee, which then very regularly holds the government of the day to account. And I think you need all of that infrastructure in place within the architecture of government to make sure that people's commitments are held to account. The second issue, I think, is when governments of whatever persuasion make commitments on policy, those need to be long term. And I think, we had a little bit with the last government, a little bit of chopping and changing on sort of one or two policies. And I think if you want to give people confidence, particularly the business community, that you want to deliver a net zero, you need to make sure that you have long-term policies and you stick with them. And the third issue, I think, is around a political consensus, because, you can have a legal framework, you can have all of that in place, but if you don't have political consensus, across the spectrum in your country, it does make it more challenging. And certainly that's one of the things that from a UK context I've pushed on, and I will continue to push on.
Thank you very much. Professor Thomas Hale from the University of Oxford. Can you tell us a bit about your research around the integrity of country and company net zero targets?
Thanks very much. So I'm going to point you to the slides behind me so I can share a few details from some of our work across Oxford Net Zero to help understand these 3 points. What's happening with net zero? What does good net zero look like? And how are we doing on implementing good net zero, which is the most important of the 3 questions. So first of all, I think we've all seen, as Sam said, a huge growth in net zero targets from countries, of course, but also from companies, from cities, from regions, from all different kinds of actors across society, from when the idea entered the scientific lexicon about 10 years ago to today. And if you look at the graph, if you go back to the first slide, sorry. If you look at the graph on the first slide, you see this huge wave of net zero has taken place over the past since the Paris Agreement in 2015. And you'll see, Lord Sharma, that COP26 is definitely one of the steeper parts of the graph, showing the importance of these kinds of events at COPs are driving action and commitments and ambition. And that we're now in a state where, if you look at the countries, which is the graph on the left, something like 93% of global GDP is covered by a net zero target. And if you look at the biggest publicly traded companies in the world, the top 2,000 of them, we're now at something like 80% of market of their annual revenue is covered by net zero target. So a huge growth in target setting. And if you jump to the next slide, you'll see that this is continuing. It's been a bit of a narrative in the last year or so around a kind of backlash against net zero in different ways. And we'll say a bit more about that in a second. But if you look at the number of new targets around net zero set in 2023 to now, it grew by 23% in companies, mostly in Asia. And it grew by 6% in states and regions. Cities and countries were more or less flat last year. But 23% growth in companies doesn't sound to me like a backlash against net zero, but actually a continuation of this wave. What does that mean, though? Is setting a target, is it a good target? What's the integrity? So if you jump to the next slide, I'm going to share just a brief set of results from some research some colleagues did in Oxford. Kaya Axelson, Matilda Becker, Alexis McGivern did a fantastic study comparing all the different standards around net zero, 37 different standards that they found, and they evaluated them across 60 different criteria. And what they found was actually a lot more convergence than divergence on what good net zero looks like, at least at the high level. And we've had a whole set of standard setting activities since net zero began to be adopted as a target. We at Oxford have done our part of, as Sam said, but also we've seen things like UN high-level champions, climate champions Race to Zero campaign has defined standards. We've seen the Secretary General's high-level expert group, a lot of high-level groups here, setting standards. And we now see the International Organization for Standardization, ISO, developing a net zero standard following their net zero guidelines that were launched last year, or 2 years ago. So this is weaving its way into the standard setting system. And this analysis shows that on some of the most important issues, like having an interim target, including scope 3 emissions, having a rigorous methodology around defining your greenhouse gas inventory, we see a lot of convergence in those standards. Although, of course, there are some areas where there's divergence. And I want to flag particularly the role of offsetting as one where, even though there's understanding in the standards that offsetting needs to be considered and explicitly accounted for, exact thresholds for what you can or can't do and how to use offsets are still a matter of some confusion between the different standards. So more work to do, but also some progress there. So final point, how are we implementing these targets that we set? If you jump to the next one, I think we have some results here from the Net Zero Tracker. Again, this is one of our projects in Oxford, looking at the different kinds of features these different targets have. These are company targets for an example. And you see in some areas they're doing pretty good. They're covering a lot of the gases, they're reporting progress annually, they're containing interim targets. Those are all important. But look at, for example, the second row here, clarity on the use of offsets. Only something like 17% of companies are giving us clarity on the use of offsets. So there's also growth to be done there. How do we fix this? Well, I think one of the ways to drive greater integrity is, of course, to go from a voluntary system to weaving net zero into the laws and policies and regulations that structure the economy. And we see actually a lot of countries adopting net zero into different range of areas, from corporate disclosure to procurement to transition planning to different sectoral policies to trade laws. This is a big new frontier, I think, for how net zero gets reflected in integrity. And let's close by inviting you all to the launch of a new project, which I can't talk about yet because it's under embargo till tomorrow. But if you go to the last slide, you'll see that we have an event tomorrow, which you're all invited to present the Climate Policy Monitor, which is going to give us a tracking of how net zero rules are being tracked into regulations and policies. So I hope to see you all there. Thank you, Daisy.
Thank you very much. So Heather Buchanan, you are the CEO of Bankers for Net Zero. This COP, of course, is all about climate finance. So just to talk a little bit about that, what are the most pressing challenges in attracting and structuring climate finance for emerging economies? And how can financial institutions maintain high standards of climate integrity in such environments?
Okay, going to do this as well. It's quite off-putting, isn't it? So thank you very, very much. So first and foremost, and I do just want it, particularly because we've got Lord Sharma here, we have to say COP26 for corporates was an absolute game changer. And the way that everything was brought under the umbrella, and the net zero targets were kind of aligned with science-based targets, because before then it was a bit of a, I wouldn't say a free-for-all, because there was a lot of potential good intention behind it, but it was all over the shop. And so that kind of process of pulling those targets together and bringing everything under one umbrella, as it were, really, really focused minds, and has enabled a level of kind of clarity through the corporate world. So it really was, it's been extraordinary to watch how much things have accelerated since then. I think one of the big things that we've got right now is, and I'll quickly go from kind of COP26 onwards, we've seen corporates go from a bit of a not knowing what you don't know elements to, to your known unknowns. And now, if anything, we see there's almost a tension in that, in order to really kind of move to the next phase, and obviously getting money flowing into emerging economies, into higher risk economies, is one of the biggest kind of questions of the day. Because we know, if you go to any room of financiers and you say, well, so we need about $275 trillion over the next 26 years, everybody kind of shrugs and says, yeah, that's there. The money's there, like it exists. And then, you go on the other side and you say, well, we don't see it. So there's obviously a blockage that sits in the system. And whilst we talk a lot about blended finance and all of these instruments, ultimately, in order to really accelerate and get where we need to, I think first and foremost, we need to work differently together. The way that policymakers in the private sector works differently together to a certain extent. The word lobbying, you know, it's got bad connotations and a dirty word, but actually, so how do we actually work together better and more transparently in order to achieve our targets? Because one thing is certain, and back to the graphs that we just saw, there are certain areas within institutions where certainly they can get as far as they can get, but then there's a lot that needs policy to unlock it, because ultimately we've got policy that's been built up and laws and regulations that have been built up on a different standard of risk and value over hundreds of years. And in a matter of, you know, very short years, we're kind of saying, well, what does risk look like now? What does value look like now? So again, apologies to anybody that was here yesterday, 1494, our first book on modern accounting. You know, we spent 500 years getting things down to the bottom line and saying, you know, P&L, balance sheet, cash flow forecast, there's your value. And now in a matter of years, we're going, well, actually, we need to bring in social impact. We need to understand forward-looking risk in terms of climate change, all of these things. And our entire system is not designed to incentivize that flow. And so I think in the short term and in terms of getting that funding flowing, it's being a lot more, I guess, innovative in terms of what blended finance means. Just off-the-shelf blended finance, a bit of a guarantee from an MDB or something isn't quite enough. And this is where we're getting really interesting capital stacks with philanthropic funding becoming much more purposeful and using philanthropic funding to actually take a slice of risk rather than just, you know, pouring some cash into a project that will kind of fix something for a short amount of time. How do we actually use that philanthropic funding? How do we use insurance? I mean, again, government guarantees, that's just an insurance policy, but the private sector is really looking at how we can do that. So how do we get these projects going? But ultimately, the idea of blended finance, these things, is to create that bridge where the markets aren't working. And fundamentally, as we're going through this and we're kind of going into a new paradigm, we have to, you know, this fundamental redefinition of what risk and value actually look like needs to become much more embedded within the system so that we're stop using the bridges and actually then the markets properly value getting to where we need to do, and they price in the externalities and the risks that we create in using natural resources and creating kind of forward-looking risk.
Thank you very much. So moving on now to Dr. Evgenia Popista from the University of Oxford and from also Ukraine. How can countries around the world pursue net zero targets while also strengthening their energy security, particularly in light of recent geopolitical tensions and supply chain disruptions?
Thanks very much for such a complex, actually, question, because I'm not sure that countries around the world are able to do that. And we actually could be witnessing countries failing in doing this. And here we should highlight that net zero should be the reflection of security, because net zero initially was meant to be standing for security. Because unless we ensure that net zero targets are met by 2050, there will be no security in broad term. I'm not talking only about the energy security of the T's, the security of the whole world. And Ukraine being the country on the forefront, witnessing how failing the net zero targets in both terms, like our continuing dependence on the fossil fuels, ignorance to prioritizing the renewable goals and pretending that we don't have enough money on the plate while we do. And this is the Ukraine that is suffering and bearing the costs of the world's ignorance to acknowledging that net zero should have been enshrined in laws, should have been supported by the appropriate elaborated policy frameworks much long before 2022 happened and even 2014 happened. So unfortunately, we have been failing. But I think that here we should aspire in Ukraine's pavilion that actually showcasing the resilience of pursuing net zero in no matter circumstances we find ourselves in. So once we are the country that is saying that we don't have enough financing or like finances to ensure or to ensure a just transition because somebody would be suffering from that, we should keep in mind that Ukraine is reaching net zero goals while fighting the war. We have it in our legislation, we have it in our policy, we have advanced very vastly on creating the frameworks that could enable financing and investment in the energy transition in Ukraine. And we were doing this before, but we did most of the chunk of our legislation since the beginning of the full Russian-scale invasion. So there is no excuses for any country around the world to say that we can compromise on net zero, no matter in what kind of geopolitical tensions we are, because net zero means security and net zero means peace. Thanks.
Thank you. Turning now to Dr. Alexei Ryabchian, who is a longtime COP veteran and an advisor to Deputy Prime Minister for European and Euro-Atlantic integration of Ukraine. How can Ukraine's reconstruction process incorporate climate resilience and net zero objectives, particularly in the face of post-conflict recovery challenges?
Thank you very much. You'll have to ask complex and complicated questions for just 3 minutes to answer. But like, first of all, I'd like to thank like Oxford University and the organizer for bringing the scientific discussion, and it's like the kickstart of our pavilion, and it will bring up the really great discussion like towards the whole process. But I would say, as a boring scientist, I love to be this from this head, but like I need to speak with the audience, saying like, what is integrity? Because I bet that none of the Ukrainians understand like what integrity means, because in Ukrainian, integrity translated into 2 different worlds. You cannot have like one term. So like one integrity is доброчесність, so the, I don't know, like good faith. And second integrity is цільність, тобто solidity, I don't know. So like, and it means that like your target for 2050 should be based on kind of scientific ground base, should be not marketing, should be not kind of blah, blah, blah. It should be, you know, like vocal. But I would say like, and I would argue that like during the war, like, and here there are a lot of people who came only first time for COP, and they don't understand what integrity means. And it's also good. Like we brought like here, like more than like, and the first time, like more than 20 companies, Ukrainian companies, national champions came here. Some of them also for the first time, just to understand like what it is for their companies. And like, they are trying to do ESG, they're trying to do the decarbonization. They are like greenwashing. They don't understand like what does it mean, but like, this is a really great start for, you know, like for become more like integral on a net zero. So this is a really great, great situation. And I would like to sell that like this year, even during the war, like Ukraine adopted climate law with the 2050 political target, which is unfortunately, I would not say like super integrity. It's like just like a political statement, like, yeah, we would like to go. Yes, it's based on our EU accession process, you know, and this inspired by our EU accession process. And it's really interesting to speak about the EU accession on a British sponsored panel, but like, nevertheless, you're out, like we are going in. Yes, but like, this is like what drives the climate agenda even during the war. The supplementary finance that comes to Ukrainian as a recovery, and where the climate change is mainstreamed. Another like word that you cannot translate in Ukraine in like one word. It's like two terminology. So this is like where the University of Oxford like can do a lot of linguistical climate change study on how, you know, like you set up the terminology and how it reflects into the national words. But regard this, like terminology is really important, because like we did the study on a recovery. So like we have more than 20 terms of a recovery process in Ukraine: green recovery, climate change recovery, green resilience, environmental. So like different type of a recovery and reconstruction in Ukraine. And the question is like, are we mean the same? Like if people from the US or from the United Nations organization or from the UK saying something, you know, about the recovery, like, and what is the measurement of this recovery? Whether it's like CO2 decreasement or the megawatt increasement or like well, like, I don't know, green jobs creation. So the terminology and the metrics of the green recovery also matters. And I guess last but not the least, about the people consensus on the net zero. You know, like when you fighting for some basic values, you know, freedom and security, and climate change, which is like more on the hierarchy of a pyramid Maslow, like might be, you know, like not essential. Because like if you speak about like climate versus the environment, you know, like our nature is dying, like Russian are destroying our nature, and this is like not what the first thing that you're doing. But like as I told you, like there is a third pavilion in a row, and it's like expanding, and I bet like the next time in Brazil we'll have even more pavilion. The more delegations are coming, like because we understand like we belong to the part of a civilized world with the values means a lot for us. Even during the war, we are progressing towards our decarbonization pathway, and like we know that our recovery will be green, resilient, climate change, and these challenges are the chance for us to build a new country for us, for our kids, for our grandkids, and also we would like also to live like nowadays in a more distant country. So yeah, thank you for the question.
Thank you very much. Such a broad range of perspectives there, showing the range of expertise we have on the panel. I'm going to ask a few more questions, and then later on there'll be a few times from audience questions. A key part of maintaining integrity in net zero targets is cutting emissions, chiefly by transitioning away from fossil fuels. Lord Sharma, you oversaw the first mention of fossil fuels in a negotiated climate text at COP26, and we saw a transition from fossil fuels being mentioned explicitly in Dubai. There are worries that this COP will not produce progress in terms of fossil fuel language, and may even result to some kind of emissions or backpedaling. How does it feel for you to know that the possibility of progress might be not maintained or even reversed when it comes to fossil fuels?
So I think this is a really important point, because I remember after we had agreement on coal phase down at COP26, during our presidency year, there were a number of parties, number of countries that were pushing back constantly on that. And we had to fight very hard to hold the line and the language in Sharm el-Sheikh. And the same thing is happening now, having agreed to transition away from fossil fuels. We've had this year a number of countries, it's always the same people, who are pushing back against what they agreed. And one of the things that I have been saying, you know, in the media at events like this, is that when countries agree something in an international setting, it's not a pick and mix menu, right? I mean, this is not, well, we quite like this bit, but we won't have that bit. If you agree to it, everything's on the menu. And you know, you may feel you're going to get indigestion by eating the whole thing, but that's what you have agreed to do. And so what I hope will come out of this particular COP is a restatement, not just on the language that was agreed in Dubai, but more importantly for countries to explain the path of how they're going to get there. I think one of our big issues is it's interesting to you know, talk about the target setting and the fact that we've got, you know, 90% of the world on net zero, which we got to COP26. All that is great, right? But then you have to look against delivery, whether actually countries and companies are actually delivering on their targets. And so what I think needs to happen at this COP is that focus on, you know, very, you know, objectively, you know, questioning countries and saying, okay, you promised to do this. Why haven't you done it? And how are you going to change your trajectory so that you deliver on these commitments? That is the only way we're going to get to net zero. If people actually, and because I think that's the other point about integrity of net zero, the integrity of the targets, but then the integrity of the delivery as well.
Thank you. Alex, did you want to comment on, from a Ukraine perspective, in terms of fossil fuel outcomes and what you hope to see here at this COP?
Yeah. I like to debate with Alec. It's a great tradition, I would say. I need to do this next year. And I like he's speaking, you know, like about a gentleman's promise, a gentleman's word. Like you promise, you deliver. Unfortunately, it didn't work that way, because like we had a Budapest Accord, which, you know, like protect us from, you know, like we withdraw the nuclear. Well, can you hear me? Oh, okay, sorry. It's yeah. So we had the Budapest Accord when we withdraw the nuclear. then we get attacked. We get lots of different other like international agreements where we will promise everything will be okay, and then no. So like we are speaking about the integrity of targets and integrity of delivery, but there should be punishment also. Like if there will be no punishment, like the withdrawal of finance or whatever, like nothing will happen. This is really important. On a delivery, you know, like we had the coal phase out 2035, but now the coal phase out happened, you know, earlier. And we are like supplementing the necessity of a flexibility generation, like let's call with the gas. Yeah, it's cleaner, it's better, but like we have some kind of like we might have some of lock-in effect when we are surviving, you know, for the winter, investing in a fast, you know, like decentralized coal gas generation, which will work as a base load currently protecting us from the winter. But it will not, you know, this money could be invested in the normal circumstances, in the renewables, in the storages, in the batteries, which will decarbonize it better. So like on the one hand side, like we are decarbonizing even better and faster than any other country in the world. But like we also should say about, you know, like justice issue, you know, climate justice, like whether the workers on these mines or like in these coal factories that have been destroyed will receive. It's like a really important context.
Thank you. I think we caught most of that. Maybe not the last sentence, but I think that's good. Thank you. So I have a question that I think I would open to the panel and see if anyone wants to answer it. So in terms of integrity, are we in fact living in a post-integrity world with the election of Donald Trump as US president? And how can we ensure integrity and net zero is preserved? And I wondered if anyone would like to start on that.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I want to sort of link it to something Yevgenia said, is that beautiful statement at the end that net zero is peace. The way I would sort of, that beautiful slogan can be turned into something technocratic. What I would say is that remember the trilemma, the sort of energy planners worrying about energy should be three things. It should be clean, it should be affordable, and it should be secure. And the trilemma was you couldn't have all three at the same time. That was sort of the worry we all had 10 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago. That no longer exists. These things now all point in the same direction. The trilemma, all three parts of it have the same solution. The solution is renewables. Renewables are clean. That doesn't need any sort of further elaboration. Renewables are now very, very cheap as well. They're the least cost opportunity in most, whenever there's a need to invest in electricity, renewables are in all likelihood the cheapest way of doing that. And they're secure in the sense that you don't depend on fossil fuel deliveries to keep the generation running. There's the intermittency, obviously, of renewables, but we find ways around that through energy storage. The decentralized nature of renewables also means that they're less sort of prone to disruption by people that have ill will to you. So the trilemma has disappeared. The solution to all three aspects is the same. And how does that link to your question? Well, it sort of starts meaning that it's in people's self-interest to do what they said they would. So integrity will sort of be meshed with self-interest, and some of those statements that you don't want to believe, and there's a lot of spin out there, but eventually self-interest will persevere, and I'm pretty sure we will see that in the United States of Donald Trump as well, where renewables happen to be cheap, they happen to be clean, and they happen to be secure, and therefore, whatever the rhetoric is, these investments will happen.
Yeah, just like a super brief intervention on the energy trilemma. I like this concept. I like it very much. I studied in Oksfordską University, but the weaponization of energy also influenced the energy trilemma. Like, see how Russians, like the first thing they did, they attacking the nuclear power station. And like, if you claim that the renewables is an answer to the energy trilemma, just like look to your right to this destroyed solar panel by Russian Iranian drone, like equipped with shrapnel, which is able to destroy the solar power station like in a 30 seconds. So this is like also like another aspect of the Russian aggression that should be studied, I would say, by the academics.
And just to follow on the optimistic note, this solar power panel can be replaced within 3 hours. So once it can be hit, it can be replaced, and it's believed to be one of the most resilient sources of energy: renewable, cheap, clean, and resilient.
Yeah, so let me just, on this point about Mr. Trump, we don't yet know precisely what he's going to do. I mean, there's been a lot that he's sort of said and his supporters have said in the lead up to the election. So I think we have to wait and see. But if he does decide to walk away from the front line of the fight against climate change, I mean, it is going to be a sort of Groundhog Day moment, because he's done this before. And previously, countries did step up. I mean, the UK stepped up. Others, I hope, will step up again. And the work on sort of delivering climate action net zero, of course, doesn't just happen at a government level. It happens at a sub-government level, sub-federal level, in the US at the states level. You've seen a lot of the money from the Inflation Reduction Act going to Republican states. Some of those legislators being very clear that they want those funds for a clean energy to continue. And you've seen the work that's going on from cities and also companies in the US and around the world. I don't think any of that is going to stop. But I also think we have to sort of acknowledge that if Donald Trump does a lot of what he says he's going to do, it will have a negative impact in terms of trying to get to net zero globally. I mean, the US is the second biggest emitter in the world. And if at a federal level they walk away, it does make it more challenging for the rest of us. But I hope one of the things that comes out of this COP is for people to say, well, okay, if the US isn't going to be on the front line with us, we just have to double our efforts and make sure that we kind of, make up as much of the gap as we can.
No, absolutely. And I think that the other key point in this is beyond the legislative frameworks. At the end of the day, Donald Trump's around for, politicians come and go and humans come and go and stuff, but the markets themselves have already started to shift quite a bit. Sorry, Barry. But the markets have shifted, and the idea that on the global scale, all the work that's going on economically around the globe is because one bloke in the States says that he doesn't want to play anymore, to think that everybody's gonna be like, oh, never mind. It's just not going to happen. That ship has kind of sailed, and that momentum has turned. And yes, they can, set it off course a wee bit along the way, or make it more difficult, create headwinds. But that transition has started to happen, and as you said, the global markets themselves are, going to outlive all of us. So.
And just to reinforce this point, when Trump came to power in 2016, the economy hadn't shifted the way Sam has described, and there was not a single US state that had a legally binding net zero target. Now 17 states have net zero targets in law, including the biggest ones except for Texas and Florida. So, this is a huge chunk of the US economy. There's an interesting study from the University of Maryland, which shows that with federal action, the United States could achieve something like a 66% cut versus 2019 levels from to in 2035. With non-state action, it could still get to 48%. So it's definitely knocking off course. That's not aligned to what a U.S. sort of trajectory to 1.5 could look like, but it's not zero. It's a lot more than zero. So this is, I think, really important to reinforce. Just want to add one further point, though, on the economics, because yes, it's never been more attractive to be transitioning to net zero. Energy is cheap, it's abundant, it's secure, and that's really driving things. However, fossil fuels are still really profitable, and they became perversely more profitable following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And so I think we need to think about how we don't just build up the good, new, bright energy future, which is emerging, but also how we manage the transition away from fossil fuels. And if we do it now, we can have a long-term phase out. We can have the right investments that are going to make sure we're doing that in a smooth way that's not going to scare the market or leave communities behind. If we do it when too late, it's going to be more expensive and much more disruptive, both politically, socially, economically, et cetera. So there's a really clear self-interest case actually for a long, deliberate, not long, a short, but deliberate and well-considered transition, as opposed to a inevitable last-minute disruptive transition.
Thank you. We have the British politician Barry Gardiner with us, who I think wants to make an intervention as well.
Thank you, and thank you hugely to the panel. I wanted to pick up on what was said about enforcement, because, well, you said politicians come and go. 27 years ago I came, I still haven't gone. But one of the things that I do recall was the importance of the realization at Copenhagen in 2009 that a top-down finger-wagging approach did not work. Now, that was what enabled Paris, it's what enabled the NDCs, it's what respected sovereignty. And that respect for sovereignty has enabled countries to come forward to pitch their pledges and promises towards net zero. But now I think from the discussion, we are talking about moving into a phase where simply relying on promises, because they don't always have good faith behind them, because they don't always have integrity, we're now beginning to say, well, how do we make sure people fulfill their promises? And the question I would have for the panel is, how do we do that? Are we looking at doing that through trade? Many countries now are looking at carbon border adjustment mechanisms, but the problem with carbon border adjustment mechanisms is they can become another trade barrier to the global south unless you hypothecate that money to go into international development. So what is the mechanism for enforcing the commitments that countries have made?
Thank you very much. Lord Sharma, would you like to answer first? I know you have to head off at 10:30.
Thanks, Daisy. So I think really sort of great points from Barry in terms of enforcement. I think there is no sort of silver bullet to this. Well, the silver bullet is that we have a global price on carbon, and everybody acts accordingly. And in every financial decision that's made, climate risk is reflected. Now, unfortunately, we're not there yet. But I think in the interim, yes, I think it will have to be measures like carbon border adjustment mechanisms. The EU obviously has one. The UK under the last government was consulting on starting ours in 2027. I assume it'll be similar trajectory under the new government. And so it is messy. And Barry's absolutely right, is that also has a perverse impact of affecting trade and particularly countries in the global south. But I think those are the sort of mechanisms we have to start with. And then I think, work in international settings on seeing how we can reach a global agreement. Just one thing I would say on this is that I know everybody sort of understandably thinks it's going to be impossible to sort of reach some price on global price on carbon. I don't think it's impossible, actually. I think we will get there. And if nothing else, we will be pushed as a result of, a changing world to get there. If you look, many years ago, there was a discussion about having a minimum corporation tax rate globally. A lot of people thought that wasn't possible, but actually through the OECD, we kind of got there. So this is possible, and I think we'll get there, but there will be bumps along the road, and maybe we will have to have individual mechanisms like carbon border adjustment mechanisms from individual countries, or in the case of the EU, a grouping of countries.
Can I follow up on that point? So the other interesting thing we see on making voluntary mandatory is in all the rules that structure company incentives. So carbon pricing, of course, is one we've known for a while, but there's a whole thousands and thousands of different kinds of policy measures being taken across different governments. They're very complicated and look differently, but they are slowly but surely beginning to weave climate goals into economic incentives. There's one example that's developed very maturely is disclosure of climate-related risk. The EU has a very ambitious standard on this. The UK has a very ambitious standard on this. But so does South Africa, so does Turkey, and as of this year, so does the state of California. So there's a lot of action to weave economic incentives around climate goals that I think will both endure across political cycles, but also create hard incentives that come into investors' decisions much more prominently. We need to accelerate that. And come to the event tomorrow to learn more when I have some concrete numbers I can share with you.
Yeah, just two observations on that. One is sort of between the balance of voluntary action and sort of enforced action. These things go hand in hand. If you sort of look, and Barry, you will remember that, if you look when climate legislation is being passed, it tends to happen, a lot of it tends to happen ahead of a major international agreement. A lot of it happened ahead of Paris at the national level, And then countries had the confidence to go into an agreement and sort of sign up to something they felt they could do. And obviously subsequently you went back home and strengthened what you had. So there's sort of a back and forth between the voluntary and the enforced. So that's a first observation. My second observation is about the power of sort of doing certain things unilaterally. It's probably not good economics, but it's beautiful to see the sort of the arms race that we see in two ways. The US Inflation Reduction Act, which basically is a piece of industrial policy and to sort of come and invest in the US if you want to be clean, that has sort of triggered equivalent subsidies elsewhere. So we have that arms race in the subsidy space. The CBAM in the EU, which is a much more defensive thing, it sort of says, don't leave my industry alone. But that has the same effect. There's a lot of countries sort of saying, if somebody is taxing my industry, it's going to be me, it's not going to be you. And so more and more of those carbon prices are coming in. So unilateral action can actually trigger international action as well.
As a person who negotiated CBAM like from Ukraine to the EU, and like CBAM will be on our border, so like we will join the EU, and like it will be, like we will be on the front line of a CBAM. So I would say that like even the discussion on a CBAM change dramatically the business behavior in Ukraine. So like a lot of businesses, instead of lobbying for like waivers, started lobbying for the emission trading system that will protect. They are ready to pay the national emission trading system and then to create some fund that will redistribute the wealth. So not the EU tax in Ukraine, but like the Ukraine tax in Ukrainian enterprises and redistribute it for the decarbonization. So I would like support this type of initiatives. But like from what I would also argue like is a leadership, like because like countries like Ukraine or like other like who see on like like G7 country or like more developed countries in the politics, we are watching not we are not listening what the leaders are saying. We are watching what you are doing. So like when the countries like or the national champions, so like top majors, like they divesting from like local jurisdiction because you have price you have the target. So like in 2050 there will be no gas sold, I don't know, in the US and UK, but like they are like expanding the other jurisdictions which are not covered by the climate targets and earning money there. So we see this some kind of like a hypocrisy. So like leadership and not only saying, but like lead by example and do.
Thanks. So I guess just the final point, because other than violently agreeing with everyone, is this is an iterative process. I mean, we are kind of pretending that we've got all of the information and all the data and all the answers and stuff, and even the real basics and like, scope 3 emissions. It's a guessing game for a lot of things. There's different models out there, but actually, so I guess there's that iterative process of just constantly raising the bar, having the kind of leadership point, really important. And people that, and whether it be nations or corporates, whatever, that lead by example, and then kind of say, well, we clearly can do it. So let's raise the bar and let's constantly keep that ratchet up, that kind of moves the needle, because a lot of what's happening now in terms of what's expected as a minimum standard, even a few years ago, seemed almost impossible for quite a few.
And I would follow up very quickly. We have amazing discussions during this conference and in this pavilion. And I would bring at the point, education. We need to educate businesses, policymakers, our next generation. We have to start with talking, not only talking about that, not only selected people coming to such conferences or those who are privileged to go to higher educational institutions. We have to start raising kids from the kindergarten, having the high awareness and how we can, and then this generation would be putting the pressure on their policymakers and would be creating the policies that would, and including this, they would have this awareness why these matters and why these laws should be followed and should be legally enforced, properly enforced. So we have to all understand what we're talking about. This is, for these days, I think this is the privilege of the selected people who pretend to understand. Thanks.
Thank you. So we have some time now for some questions. So does anyone in the audience have a question to ask our panel? Yes, I don't know if there are traveling microphones. If not, I can pass on. I'll pass you this one. Thank you.
I was just curious about your thoughts regarding the applicability of net zero as a concept to companies. It's a rather clean concept when you consider a political jurisdiction or certainly globally. But then when we transition it to a corporate context where you have overlapping value chains, emissions and removals are double counted, I think it creates a lot of challenges and leads to the confusion about, for example, the use of offsets or other market-based adjustments. So yeah, would just love your reflections on how that net zero concept has been applied and maybe how we need to improve the application to make it fit for purpose.
Yeah, I can pick up on this. Like, I was working as an advisor to the biggest Ukrainian oil and gas firm on like decarbonization. So I just like literally saw how the mindset of the CEOs like shifted and how the company from, you know, like not giving a them once. Thank you, maybe it, yeah. How they, you know, how it changed, how it evolved. And like being like it's my 9th COP, and I remember like, you know, like how it started in Paris and like what the mindset of the Ukrainian companies are, and like 10 years have passed and they're thinking about this. Yeah, like if you're a CEO, you're not thinking about 2050, you're thinking about like 2000 and, you know, like 3 years in advance, and then like I don't care, like it will be not me who will implement this. But like, yeah, like these 3 or 4 years are also important. If they are like focused on a scope 1 or scope 2 emission and kickstart, like this concept will like there need to be time to this concept go through the DNA of the company. So this is like superly important when the top management understand everything, and you come to the, I don't know, like district representative, which not given them about anything, you know, like related to green. So like you need to have time for this company in developing countries. And one more time, lead by example, because like they are reading the, I don't know, like Shell, Chevron, like whatever sustainability reports and trying to copy paste, trying to understand this concept. Then like in Ukraine, for example, a lot of money comes from the IFIs, and they funds just like a basic ESG strategies, like decarbonization strategy, which is required to attract the finance. So this is like a process as a developmental economist. Like I would say, like in my country, it started and it's successful. Not as fast as like it could be and should be to have the 1.5 degrees, but you know, like we're doing it even through the wars, which amazed me a lot.
Is that it? Okay, sorry. Also within this, so again, back to this kind of iterative process where we've got a lot of the kind of laws and regulations that get tweaked along the way to kind of raise the bar. One of the things that struck me particularly over the last years, and speaking with lots of kind of leaders in C-suites of, you know, major international corporations, is just how much pressure they get from their employees these days, and the younger employees coming in. So there is kind of a natural kind of societal shift that's happening, which goes to the point around education. You know, back in the day when I'm sure that more than a few of us in the room can remember that the kind of power dynamic between employer-employee was, you know, the kind of strict job interview and stuff. It's quite interesting when you hear how much people, like firms, feel like they're getting interviewed by talent based on what their kind of objectives as a firm are and stuff. And so that gives me kind of hope as well as part of that process, that actually it's the kind of that bottom up swell as well.
Yeah, that actually rings a bell when we interview people. But what I wanted to say about the sort of the scope 1, 2, 3, I would make a distinction between accounting and agency. If your purpose is to accurately measure who emits what and have a sort of a rational accounting or measurement system, then scope 1, 2, 3 is a mess. And you know, my accounting colleagues complain forever about the double counting. They forever about the lack of time delineation. It's just, as an accounting system, it doesn't work. it does work as a system of agency. If you ask, what should a company feel responsible for? What should a company feel an obligation to manage? Then scope 1, 2, 3 works, because it makes you responsible also, or it gives you agency also over the emissions that happen in your supply chain. And that's important from a responsibility point of view, but it's meaningless from an accounting point of view.
And if I could just build on that point, I think because net zero is a concept from atmospheric physics, it really works best at the level of the globe, of the planet. It's about a global atmospheric state that we must achieve to prevent further warming of the planet. And once you disaggregate that to a country or a region or indeed a company, you have to figure out the boundary question. And in this august body, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, we agreed in 1992 that we would count territorial emissions. So the exports of oil and gas, for example, are not counted in the country's target. That's the country equivalent of scope 3, if you will. Obviously, countries have a huge amount of agency, to Sam's point, on what they export and how that's counted. So I think it's really important to think about it in those terms. And for companies, my observation has been that the confusion around scope 3, which is of course vast and requires a huge amount of data and maybe a futile exercises anyway, can risk distracting from the important thing, which is to find where you have most leverage on emissions and reduce them as quickly as possible. And that's, I think what you see in the net zero standards we've been reviewing, they all are pretty unanimous on this front, that the first prioritization is to figure out what you can control and to do as much as you can urgently on that. So even though, you should look globally at your total footprint, there's a very clear prioritization that is both obvious and increasingly reflected in the standards and regulations that we see.
Thank you very much. Do we have any more questions on the floor? Yeah, of course, go.
Thomas, just to pick up on what you were saying there about territoriality, do you not think that there is also a perverse incentive because of territoriality for such as biomass, the obvious example of Drax in the UK, and the way in which territoriality is incentivizing the UK to continue with what is an unsustainable fuel?
I think that's exactly right. And there's been some progress on some entities, the state of California, a number of cities around the world have tried to include sort of imported emissions into their inventories in different ways. It's still, sort of leadership practice. It's not something that's required or standardized, but I think that's really pointing to this question. If you want to be a leader, you should take the obvious common sense approach of we should think about what we're influencing, and bringing in dead trees to burn is certainly a good example of where you could be thinking more effectively about your impact.
Yeah, to follow up a bit on your, to develop your idea on the territoriality, who is responsible for the Nord Stream 2 emissions, which were blown up and sent to the air? Like aggressors, like whatever, like who is responsible for the additional emissions because of the war, like on our territory? Like it's we, because it's on our books, on our territorial in our territory, and we need to put them into our NDC and then claim Russia as the aggressor. So there are huge amount of this issue, and we are innovating because we are calculating the emissions come from the war, including those that, for example, recently to come from London to Japan. You work from, you fly through one hemisphere, but then in the regard of Russia aggression, they close their skies, and you need to fly from another hemisphere, which will increase the number of CO2 emitted. Who will pay for this? On what budget it is? And when you try to raise as a negotiator this question to the plenary, it's useless. So aggressor pay, not only we have the ecocide concept, but the climate damage, which is a new and innovative approach. It should become from a political concept to a legal concept, which will stop future war happening. Because if aggressor knows that he will pay not only for the damage, not only the reparation, but the damage to the climate, which might be enormously big, if you connect it with the global CO2 price concept, it might stop future wars.
And picking up on that, the omission of NDC mentioning war-related emissions or military emissions, this is the huge loophole. Because, Pentagon was trying to greenwash, oh my gosh, a little bit with this regard, and like trying to incorporate like the best climate actions like overall, like, but we don't report military related emissions. And this is the big hole. And like very quickly, like possibly it's like differentiated by shared responsibility. So territoriality, shared responsibility.
Thank you very much. Do we have any more questions in the room? Yes.
Hi. So it was a while ago in this discussion, the conversation about renewables, and Sam and Alex, you were both talking about this quite a bit. And Sam, you were referring to the trilemma and talking about how renewables are now kind of just an overall very, very good option going forward and make the most sense. And then Barry was actually talking about when you gave your intervention, so just kind of connecting that, you were talking about how a top-down finger-wagging approach doesn't work as much. And so I think when it comes to this kind of trilemma and this issue about renewables and things like this, there's a lot of kind of focus there on the supply side and kind of less attention given there to it being like such a good, perfect solution on the consumer side. And then, yeah, if you kind of just come to the consumers, it's on, the onus is kind of on them as much as it is on the suppliers to make that change themselves and have them kind of just take, like the people basically take ownership of their futures and the environment as well. There's more of a balance to be had. You can't just kind of have top down from the policy or top down from the suppliers. What do you think of that? It's an open question as well.
Yeah, it sort of speaks to the balance between, I guess, behavioral solutions versus technological solutions, which the tech tends to come from the supply side, behavior tends to come from the demand side. There's a good statistic in the UK from the Committee on Climate Change, where in the UK we have those very detailed decarbonization plans that sort of underpin the carbon budgets we had. And if you split those very detailed lists of measures that we need, you get a very rough, I'm rounding quite badly here, but you roughly get a 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 split. 1/3 of the solution is tech, that's things like renewables. 1/3 of the solution is behavior, that's sort of how much we fly and what we eat. And 1/3 is both. That's things like heat pumps and electric cars, which is a tech solution, but they need behavioral engagement with them because we have to do things slightly differently. So 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, these two things come together, but you're absolutely right. We tend to obsess a little bit too much about the tech solutions and not enough about behavior.
You turn it off, sorry. Yeah, so I will transform your question into, like top down versus bottom up. So like, it's good to have both, like it means like that the process, like the political process, the technological process will fly like much faster. But like I saw a lot of example of having like only, like bottom up. So like when people want something and, they pressure the government, or employees want something, they pressure the company. But also like I have personal example of, like only top down, because like I used to be a member of Ukrainian parliament, and like I spent like 20 years on climate change, and like it required only 3 people, like one in the government, like myself in the parliament, and like one lady in the office of president, for Ukraine to ratify the Paris climate agreement. We were the second parliament in the world to ratify it. First was Norway. You cannot beat Norway on environmental and climate. Like we were second. I was really proud of this. Like it required only leadership. I posted on Facebook saying like finally, like I did it as a scientist, and like I have a Wikipedia line on this. But like the comments from the people, like from the Ukrainians, was like, what hell, what climate change? Like increase the pensions, like work on taxes, like whatever. So like, and I haven't been re-elected, but I'm really proud of this, and we progress in a lot of stuff. So like, it's like answering your question, it's good to have both, like everything, like demand side, supply side. Like this is like a synergy that we are like fighting for. Like if you have only leadership on the top, people who don't believe it, or like the grassroots initiative who pressure the government, it's also works perfectly.
Interesting. Thank you. Did you have anything you wanted to add or no? Okay. Do we have any more questions in the room? If not, I have another question about integrity. So I'm sure everyone on this panel would have seen that this COP presidency has faced allegations of using COP29 for secret oil and gas deals. And it's the second year in a row that these kind of allegations have been made of a COP president. Is there still integrity in the COP process? I don't know, Alex, if you fancy addressing that question.
As a person who, like, I'm from the Eastern European group, like last year, like I was voted for Azerbaijan, so I'm responsible for having COP here. And like, I would say it's better to have, like, was to have it in boring Bonn. It's better to have it in like more fun Baku. I was thinking about the responsibility. And this is like, I don't like the word like post-Soviet, but like this is like a post-Soviet country. It's like the first COP in this region, because like you Poland who were hosting the COP discussion. And like first when Baku kind of like they got the COP and then they formed the organizing committee. In 5 days they were like criticized and ruined by the Guardian article, if I'm not mistaken, that the organizing committee was full of men and like not gender equality. It was like a big scandal. Like in 1 week, the government added, I don't know, like deputy minister on education, like healthcare agency, like all the women they have in the government, they added to the organizing committee. And then like another article said like the Azerbaijani national company Sakar doesn't have the kind of ESG report, sustainability decarbonization strategy. Why on earth they're like doing like their greenwashing? 1 week, like Sakar like did the like ESG strategy, represented the, you know, like Karabakh green recovery process, so they're responding. Then like another like scandals and they're responding. So like, yeah, there are critiques, and like maybe when the COP will leave, they will be, yeah, they will be rolled back. This region will receive this kind of injection of values, you know, on what to do and what not to do. So be criticized, like you should criticize, for them to improve. I see that trying to, you know, like to become a part of this world where these values are. So they're doing the Formula One, they did the Eurovision. So like they would like to be, and like they're trying to learn, you know, like living on this issue where the integrity of your oil and gas production should be respected. Revenues reinvested into the green development.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I think, you know, looking beyond any one COP, we do have a leadership problem in international climate politics, where because we set up this system of annual meetings and we never adopted rules of procedure, a lot of weight falls on the host country to help define the agenda, to invest political capital, to bringing together agreement. And if you change that person every year, that host, it's going to be less effective than if you had more continuity and more clarity. And I think that's really hobbled the ability of the UNFCCC process to be as effective as it could be. We have a new innovation in that space. There's now the so-called troika, so 3 presidencies, last one, current one, future one, working together. And I think that is helping to overcome this a little bit. But it is really hard for us to kind of imagine continuity in the system. So I think we need to actually revisit how we structure leadership around the COP. We also have a situation where this year, because maybe it's before the sort of big ratchet moment next year, or for whatever reason, after a big global stock take last year, there's, I think, and because of world events, there's only a few of the major world leaders who are coming to the COP. Only a few of the major, you know, financial CEOs who are coming to the COP. And I think this idea of integrity is part of that. If you see a presidency really leaning into a high integrity, investing time and effort, that's going to draw people in. And if you don't see that, then people don't feel they have a necessary compelling reason to come. So I think it's also a bit of a self-interest for a presidency to make their COP a success by really investing the time, effort, energy, and credibility that's going to draw people in.
Interesting. Okay. So I think at this point, what I will do is I'll go to each panel member one by one. And based on everything that we've spoken about today, if you could kind of draw together a minute or two of your concluding thoughts and remarks to go forward into the rest of COP, that would be great. So I don't know if it will work starting with Sam. That's okay with you, and then just go all the way down and finish with Thomas. Is that okay?
Yeah, sort of my main reaction on that panel is it's very hard to sit on a panel with my Ukrainian colleagues because I'm sort of in my ivory tower. It all feels abstract and theoretical. And for you guys, it's real, it's here, it's now, you feel it, you can make the links. So it's quite sort of, yeah, it was a sobering experience for me to hear that reality. What does it all mean for the COP we're currently sort of experiencing? I think integrity will be at the core of it. We sort of we've seen that statistic, which for me is sort of one of the main statistics that are out there. The targets are there, the 93% of GDP that's covered by targets. If everybody did what they said, we would sort of, we'd be not well below 2 degrees, but below 2 degrees. We would be there. So the difference between the target and the implementation, the credible implementation of the target, that's where we are. That's where we have to focus on.
Absolutely, I think that the implementation piece. So we've done the measuring, we've done there's a level of transparency we need about what we don't know as well, and I think we need to get much better at as we implement, because that's where the kind of rubber hits the road, as it were. That we must be kind of transparent, honest with the kind of wider communities. I mean, we can all sit here and most people don't speak in acronyms. That like we do in these COPs and whatnot. And so kind of at that implementation stage, how that translates and gets communicated and how we bring people along with us as well as part of that is going to be integral to that integrity piece. Otherwise, we're just, we're speaking in a bit of a vacuum, as it were.
I don't know what you need to be said. Like you're like a great academician, like who brings a lot of knowledge, and like you're helping us to implement this knowledge into practice. So we're not sad. Like you should be proud of this. That having like Evgenia and myself, I also I'm not Oxford but like Sussex educated, and we're like realizing our like knowledge coming like that came from your island, to Ukraine. And like having said it, like I am sad for we having this conversation only here. So you are like highly welcome in Kyiv. We'll gather like a bigger crowd, like, and you can influence with all of the discussion that we have for the real changes of a real country who is trying to access European Union, trying to become more, westernized, trying to become more climate resilient and more responsible. So hope to see you next time in Kyiv.
Picking up on possibly Alex's last words, actually, I miss the point that we didn't have these discussions 10, 20 years ago. And the point that you're referring to yourself as an ivory tower, but it's actually not true because you have become like overall, there are certain centers around the world that have become these centers of knowledge, knowledge-based. But this is again linking to the education. And possibly integrity of net zero could be the integrity of educating awareness, peace, and open for innovation, because I think we are missing so many puzzles. And we have talked a lot about technicalities and the realities of Ukraine. But to connect it all together, possibly we just need to be humans and to understand what other people feel and to understand what is the most important. And the most important, we want to live in a peace, secure, and safe world. And if we have it in mind, if every single business leader, country's leader would be following these, being humane and being human, possibly this truly will be the world a better place.
Well, I'm not sure I can improve on Evgenia's fantastic final words there. I'll just note, Evgenia, you said it's we're starting 10, 20, 30 years too late. And that's absolutely correct. But the second best time to start is now. And if we don't start now, what will our next generation be saying in 10 or 20 and 30 years? And the good news is that we have started. We've seen some evidence today of that transition in process. So we know we need to do more. We know we're not on track, but there is lots that we can do. And that agency, as you see, the ability to make a difference is the thing we mustn't lose hope of. And education should give us a clear idea of the world, the challenges it has, but also understand where we can intervene. And I think we're seeing progress on integrity. We talked about the regulation piece. We didn't mention, for example, some of the litigation we see. Last month or 2 months ago, the Korean Constitutional Court ordered the government to increase its climate targets to protect future generations, right? So it's law coming to play there. In a few minutes' time, we're going to hear the outcome of the Shell case. It's being announced in the Netherlands today on its big landmark case there. So litigation, regulation, building political power around the transition is happening, and we can make it happen faster.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all our panelists for joining me. And thank you to you all for joining us in the room at the Ukraine Pavilion. And thank you very much. And I hope everyone enjoys COP29. Oh, thank you.
Oh, there we are. You should be. Yeah. Or, like everyone wants to